Chelsea Pamela Chandler was born to Francine, and I just under 7 months after we were married. I was thrilled to be a father, but it surprised me that Francine didn't seem thrilled to be a mother. She assured me, after I noticed it enough to mention it, that it was probably just her hormones still out of whack, coupled with a possible bout of postpartum depression. I agreed with this explanation, and we delved even deeper into our little home bubble, as typical young parents in today's world with active lifestyles. I went out into the world daily to serve as the family breadwinner, and Francine stayed home to be the breadwinner. But Francine hired a nanny without consulting me. When I asked about the strange woman I saw leaving the apartment when I returned from work one day, Francine simply said it was a done deal. Given Francine's position in society and her professional ambitions, she simply could not let the presence of a child among us deter her. Francine returned to work 2 months after Chelsea was born. Although we both worked for her father, Francine insisted on driving her own car to work so that she would not be perceived as having lost her independence just because she had become a wife and mother. The business required her presence, she explained, and her father was counting on her. Meanwhile, Alicia rarely showed up at the house when I was around. It seemed that every time there was a gathering at the Thompson home that I could attend with Francine, Alicia had an appointment elsewhere. I still had feelings for my wife's younger sister, but the sense of obligation to her and the obligations to our marriage and new family were beginning to outweigh those feelings. Alicia's absence, mostly due to her college classes, yes, at Scott, didn't seem to bother Francine one bit. And even when she was around, Alicia showed nothing but animosity, and even outright hostility, toward me, toward her parents, and even toward Francine. No, I certainly wasn't going to add myself as a friend on Alicia's Facebook page. All marriages eventually fall into a routine, and young couples establish routines and house rules that are best suited to establish domestic tranquility. This was as true for Francine and I as it would be for any other couple. Except, in our family, the work order and house rules were what Francine wanted them to be. In order to maintain domestic tranquility in our family, I found that I just had to go along with whatever Francine wanted. Oh, every once in a while I was able to get my way on something innocuous. But by and large, it was my loving wife who determined how often and where we went, who our friends were, and how we handled our finances. I just wanted peace of mind in this relationship, so risk-averse and with a honed tendency to avoid conflict, I went along with Francine most of the time. Apparently, she wanted to avoid pregnancy too, as our intimacy dwindled to about once a week for the first year, and then to once every 2 weeks after that. About a year and a half after we were married, I noticed Stedman Carstairs walking around the office at work. When I asked Francine about it, she simply said that Carstairs had finished his MBA at Harvard and had taken a job at a Boston firm. But apparently he will be servicing his company's southeastern clients and visiting them almost every other month. Isn't that nice? Yeah, it sure is. What could I say that I just didn't care for this smarmy bastard? Not a chance in hell. I wasn't about to get confrontational about it, even if it meant I had to put up with what seemed to Carstairs a somewhat inappropriate closeness to my wife. Almost exactly 31 months after Chelsea was born, little Grace Ann Chandler made her debut on the world stage. Francine was furious that she was pregnant for the second time in her life and blamed me for it. But as it turned out, she had adjusted to showing Gracie as much motherly love as Chelsea. More than enough, in Francine's opinion, but by no means enough, in my humble opinion. I gave both of my girls all the attention and love I was capable of, and they seemed to gravitate toward me as they grew. Although they didn't seem overly attached to their mother, they still had a childlike love for both parents, which was only natural. By the time our girls were in elementary school, there was a certain boredom in our marriage. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but it was there nonetheless. Next chapter. A sudden shudder on the airplane flying to Atlanta brought me out of the drowsiness that had taken hold of me. When I looked back, I saw that the beverage van had passed my seat, and I had missed the opportunity to drink a soda and eat some biscotti. The two stewardesses in the coach where I was sitting were struggling with the beverage cart, as it tipped over and rested against the seats on the, what's the right word? Left. No. Right side. The coffee pot tipped over on one gentleman who screamed in pain, dousing himself with hot liquid. Once the drink cart was corrected, the nearest of the two attendants attempted to help the man wipe the hot liquid away with a handful of cocktail napkins. I heard a sound and looked ahead to see that a first-class flight attendant had pulled back the dividing curtain. She strode purposefully toward the other two flight attendants manning the cart and whispered to them in a low voice, but with a sense of urgency that couldn't help but alarm those who witnessed it. As I hurried back, behind the other two flight attendants and the attendant cart, but at a slower pace, I saw the first-class flight attendant reach for the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," I heard her slightly out-of-breath voice, though a smile appeared on her face as she turned to face the passengers. "I apologize for the inconvenience, but it appears that we have encountered a bit of turbulence. Due to this, we have decided to reduce the beverage service. Depending on flight conditions and the time we have before arrival, we will await instructions from the airfield before resuming." Another violent jolt shook the airplane, causing a roller coaster feeling in the gut. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking," came a male voice from the cabin speakers and from the headphones of those who were still listening to music, news, or comedy through the airplane's sound system. "We have encountered an unpleasant situation. If you are not already in your seats, I ask you to quickly return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Please remain in your seats with your belts securely fastened until we reach calmer conditions. At that time, I will take care to turn off the fasten your belt signs." The authoritative voice and decisive action seemed to have a calming effect on all of us, but it still didn't calm me down, so I tightened my seatbelt and leaned back in my seat. Next chapter. When the economy went south, my job became a little more interesting, if you can call work more interesting. That means I had to work harder to keep my clients' numbers up. The slightest movement in the markets could lead to big trouble, so I had to stay alert. And I had to work harder and longer, and I was really on top of things. In business, anyway. As for my marriage, I had no idea that not only was I not on top of things, I wasn't even in the middle, and I was actually almost at the very bottom of the heap. Enough metaphors. You've already figured out what's going on here, I'm sure. Francine still worked for Daddy at the company, ostensibly in the marketing department, but I never could figure out exactly what she was doing. She shut me down and avoided answering me every time I tried to show interest, taking advantage of my soft nature. Thus, she kept me in her place. Although I wasn't sure of the extent of her duties, I figured they must be important to the success of the Thompson business empire. Eventually, she began traveling more frequently on business trips, and sometimes at short notice. And these trips must have required physical and mental effort on her part, because after she returned, she was not in the mood for any intimacy with me for several days. And even when we were physically close, she didn't seem to be into it. And when she wasn't traveling, Francine went out more and more, supposedly with the girls from work. Perhaps I'm naive, but I could tell that these nocturnal adventures involved more than just letting off steam with the girls. But even if she was cheating on me, at least she wasn't showing it to my face. And I was too wound up to confront her. I didn't want to end up in a divorce situation with the consequences that would follow. Irregular contact with my children, financial poverty. Nevertheless, that's exactly what happened. Next chapter. The economy was recovering slower than predicted, and I kept working hard, trying to hold on to my position in the company and keep my boss happy, all the while trying to be a good and faithful husband and father. I didn't realize how hopeless my situation was until one day my father-in-law called me into his office. When I arrived, I was surprised to find not only Mr. Thompson there, but my wife, his daughter Francine, along with a lawyer I had met just before the wedding, and one other person. This person was in her early 20s, dressed in early Target style and chewing gum while standing noticeably apart from the other three. From the stereotypical description, you can guess who she was, I'm sure. Yep, straight from the casting call of the process servers. "Mr. Lewis Chandler?" She stepped forward and asked, while the others smirked and stood silent. Uh, yes. A brilliant answer. A truly mind-blowing one. Just what a junior executive in a thriving business should say at a time like this, right? A manly statement. Mr. Chandler, you have been served, she said, placing a large sealed envelope in my hand. I didn't answer anything. I was still confused. I just stared at the package in my hand. I was slightly startled by a flash next to me. When I looked up, I saw that she had taken a picture of me with her digital camera. I'm sure the frame included the designer clock on the Thompson wall behind me to confirm the date time on the picture she took while I was being served. As the document server withdrew, I heard Francine sniffle and turn to her in shock at the rapidly unfolding events and in curiosity at what sounded like her crying. Louis, she said quietly without looking at me. How could you? Needless to say, I had no idea about any of this, especially that comment. Mr. Sharktooth made sure to clear things up quickly. Mr. Chandler, Thompson's lawyer said, I have a deposition from one Joan Hartman, an employee of the department you influenced in hiring, firing, and promotion, in which she claims you coerced her. He waved a piece of paper that had all the hallmarks of officialdom. You, sir, continued the lawyer, are guilty not only of adultery with this innocent young woman. At this, he pointed to Francine, who was busily pressing a napkin to one eye, obviously wiping away a tear. You are also in violation of the marriage contract you signed before you entered into union with Francine Thompson. And, I might add, Thompson looked at me with an expression not exactly of anger but satisfaction. You are in violation of company policy prohibiting inappropriate personal relationships between senior and subordinate employees. Leaning toward me, he removed his glasses and said the following. And you should just be happy that Mr. Thompson is not going to pursue your prosecution under violations of state or federal labor laws. I was numb. I had no idea who a person named Joan Hartman could be. I had no idea why this was happening to me. And why now? But, true to my nature, I just shrunk within myself and kept quiet. You have 30 minutes to clear your desk and office of all personal belongings. Needless to say, you cannot log onto the computer network from this point on, as your access to it has been revoked. One of these two gentlemen standing behind you will take your keys and your parking lot entry card. Thompson was on a roll. And you bastard, Francine cut in. Your things are packed and stacked by the front door of the condominium. I've changed the locks, so you need to come in when I'm there tonight. But before 8 o'clock tonight, I finally found my voice. The girls? They're at their mom's for the next few days, Francine interrupted me. I've also applied for a restraining order to keep you away from us, as I'm afraid your previous signs of aggressive behavior could put me and my children in danger. I had finally had enough. Mouse growled. What do you mean by aggressive temper, Francine? I shouted, probably for the first time in 10 years. I have never raised my voice, much less my hand, in anger at you or my girls. At this point, Mr. Thompson added with a thin smile. You see, Jim? He looked at his attorney and continued. If you need a witness about his anger problems, all you have to do is call me to testify during the hearing. I now realized that I had been cornered by professionals. I was shocked, angry, frustrated, and completely out of it. I felt a hand on my elbow and noticed two security guys escorting me to my office. By late afternoon, I was driving back down the I-20 freeway toward my parents' house. My car was packed with boxes of stuff I had taken out of the office, as well as 8 large garbage bags of clothes, toiletries, and other items from the apartment I no longer shared with my loving family. I was still reeling from the way I had been treated by my wife and her father and their predatory attorney. I may have been embarrassed by this Joan Hartman's claim of so-called stalking, but I finally got really angry, perhaps for the first time in my adult life. I had been set up. It was so obvious to me. As I drove and tried to avoid the semi-trucks and other cars heading toward the perimeter highway around Atlanta and beyond, I pondered what had happened. They'd gotten some poor low-level employee to lie, probably intimidated her with a job threat or something else that concerned her personally, to get me fired. The adultery claim was drafted so that the prenup would go into effect at the same time the divorce petition was filed. The only thing I couldn't understand was the setup because of my so-called anger issues that caused the restraining order. I exhaled and shook my head. I could only assume that Francine had used this opportunity during my confinement to turn my girls against me. Well, I would fight like crazy to prevent that, somehow. Next chapter. 2 weeks passed, and I still hadn't socialized with my girls. Out of our friends, I could only count on a couple people who weren't really just Francine's friends. They all cut me off too, refusing to even talk to me or return my calls. One or two of them even told me that they should give me a whipping for the way I was deceiving poor Francine. Oh well, so much for the chance of a fair hearing from any of them. And one of the few friends I could count on was Ted Stafford. One evening over a drink, he brought me up to speed. Lou, Ted began, after I had been prying information out of him for about 30 minutes. I don't know what to tell you. How about the truth, Ted? I asked him. Look, I haven't heard anything, and I miss my girls as much as anyone. Ted became very uncomfortable with this remark. Then, apparently having come to some sort of decision, he took a sip of his JB, put the glass down, and looked at me. Okay, Ted began, but you're not going to like hearing this. I frowned slightly and nodded for him to continue. Well, Ted said to me, you asked for it, so here goes. And with that, my world continued to crumble. Not only did Francine evict me, but she put in my replacement. Wow. Not a week later, she moved her new man in with her, and my girls. You get the picture, I'm sure. It was Stedman Carstairs. That jerk, Carstairs, finally divorced his wife because of his own infidelity. He'd left her in Massachusetts with the baby and moved back to Decatur, to the home of, and apparently between the legs of, my soon-to-be ex-wife, Francine. As far as Ted could tell, Carstairs and Francine had never gotten rid of their feelings for each other over the years. Carstairs had broken up with Francine only after she had apparently gotten pregnant by me at the same time he started Harvard. And after he moved to Cambridge, he got pregnant by some girl from Wellesley and was eventually forced to marry her. The girl's father was a very wealthy man who had gone from being a simple Irish Southerner in Boston to the head of a fairly successful business empire in the Northeast, but he still maintained ties to the Irish gangs in his old haunts. Now, however, Carstairs was divorced from his own wife and living in a house that was supposed to be mine, sleeping with my wife and being around my kids. And that kind of opened my eyes to a possible explanation for how it all happened. When Francine first got pregnant, she wanted to be with Carstairs. But he was unavailable because he'd already moved to Cambridge and had a relationship with a girl there. Mr. Thompson couldn't allow his princess to be without a mother, so the Thompson family needed a scapegoat. But why keep me around so long after using me to solve Francine's pregnancy problem? Love? Damn it. Control? Maybe. After all, Thompson had known for a long time that I was gathering information on him. It brought to mind the other half of the old adage. Keep your enemies close. Why hit me now? Apparently, Carstairs was now available to Francine. Thompson no longer needed me, since his IT people had destroyed my evidence against him, and I no longer had access to it. I was now expendable. Damn it. I vented all my frustration to Ted. Ted now looked very uncomfortable. At my request, he continued. Lou, you're not going to like this either, but I've heard from some of Francine's so-called friends that she wants her girls to call Stedman Carstairs daddy now. Before I could explode, he continued. I sat back down on the bar stool and was silent for the next few minutes until I heard Ted order another round for the two of us. Being an accountant, I had a knack for math. At that moment, I was in the process of calculating Francine's possible contacts with a certain Stedman Carstairs in those days. Or should I say, those days? Or should I say, those days, plural, when she was pregnant? Unfortunately, the numbers didn't lie. And they didn't seem to lie now either, as I looked back on the last 16 years of my formerly quite satisfactory, if not happy, life. a life that I now realized was based almost entirely on lies and deceit. I had tolerated it because I hadn't had the guts to do anything about it then, and I couldn't do anything about it now either. Next chapter. The divorce procedure itself went quickly. I hastily hired a lawyer, an inexpensive one since I didn't have access to much money, and Francine and her old man were trying to take our previously joint assets away from me. But my young lawyer, no matter how hard he tried, was never able to stop the tsunami of crap coming down on me. I was forced to keep paying rent because my kids lived in the apartment and they needed stability to stay in their familiar home. And of course, they needed the care of a loving mother during the difficult times after the divorce. My attorney strenuously objected to many of the issues presented by Francine's attorney, especially regarding employment, and the judge sometimes agreed with us. However, I could tell that the work issues inevitably crept into the mind of the woman acting as judge in our case, leading her to believe that I was just another womanizer who was trying his best to pollinate all the women in his workplace while he still could. And to hell with my family. I also ended up having to pay a bunch of child support. I loved my two girls and would never have resented paying child support. Next chapter. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking, came the voice from the airplane's sound system again. We were all starting to get nervous by now due to the continued shaking and bouncing. An unusually strong storm front is moving in from the Gulf of Mexico, extending from New Orleans through Little Rock and Louisville, and it's between here and Atlanta. As you can imagine, we've been experiencing the turbulence caused by the front for some time now. All flights are currently suspended at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in Atlanta. All gates are full, and we have nowhere to go even if we land there. So we have been directed to Nashville International Airport to wait out the storm. Please keep your electronic devices on, and we will make sure that an announcement of the diversion, and thus delay in your arrival, is given to the agents at the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport gate. I remind you that we are on the edge of a storm front, and we need you to remain in your seats with your seatbelts securely fastened and follow the instructions of the crew members. They are professionals and care more about your safety than anything else. With a loud click, his message ended. The airplane was lurching, and I could see flashes of lightning around us every now and then as we were obviously in the western part of the thunderstorm front. When I felt the captain move the airplane into a hard left roll, panic set in within me. Not being a very brave person, I also had a regular fear of flying. And this situation was just getting to me. For some reason that I can't remember even now, I remembered Mookie's admonition about the Nasib stone embedded in a simple metal bracelet that I put in my pocket. It attracted absolutely no attention when I put it in the cup going through the TSA checkpoint at the MSP airport. Now, for some reason, I reached into my pocket and quickly slipped the small bracelet onto my left wrist, fastening the simple clasp. Praying for a safe landing, I almost unconsciously rubbed the stone in the small bracelet in a circular motion with the index finger of my right hand. I just hoped that God didn't mind that I was engaging in a superstitious act the whole time I was praying. Suddenly, my vision blurred, and simultaneously I heard and felt the airplane shudder slightly as the captain began to lower the landing gear for the approach to Nashville International Airport, which was now very bumpy. Oddly, the blurriness was only in my left eye. As I realized this, my left eye cleared up, and my right eye blurred. It seemed that each of my eyes was clearing and losing clarity independently of each other, or even in an alternating rhythm. Now I was truly frantic. I prayed harder, rubbed faster, and my eyes alternately dimmed and clarified faster and faster. Then I think I passed out. Next chapter. Next chapter. When I came to my senses, things were pretty strange. The oddity was that I wasn't on the airplane, and I wasn't lying down. And everything was so quiet. I leaned against the sink counter in the men's restroom, located down the hall from the stairs leading to my office. And here's the thing. This was the office at my old job, the one I had been kicked out of a few months before. While contemplating that I'd better get out of here before old man Thompson discovered I was trespassing, I noticed my reflection in the mirror above the sink. While my eyes were still performing the left eye, right eye, dim, clear action. I saw in my reflection that my pupils were alternately dilating and constricting. At the top point, the pupil was almost completely covering the iris, so that I couldn't even tell the color of the eye. At the lowest point, it was as if the eye was almost all color, and the pupil was just a tiny dot. I washed my hands and wiped my face with water as the blackout began to subside. After about 30 seconds, I saw in my reflection that the alternating pupils in my eyes had weakened and were no longer visible. I panicked for a moment when one of the guards who had escorted me out of here months ago walked in to do his business. I was sure he would grab me by the scruff of the neck and my pant leg and shove me out of the establishment through the nearest door or window, whether it was open or not. "Did you comb your hair, Mr. Chandler?" the guy asked in a friendly manner, heading for the urinal. He said it just like he might have said it before all this shit started here. Taking advantage of the guy's distraction to take a piss, I walked out of the men's room, wondering how I got from the turbulence aboard an airplane landing in Nashville, Tennessee, to the quiet men's room at my old workplace in Decatur, Georgia. The men's room was next to the lobby on the second floor, so I could see the TV in the waiting area. It was tuned to CNN. Hey, this is the Metro Atlanta area and TED Network's rule here. I almost passed out when I saw what was being shown on the screen. On the screen was a live broadcast of a thrilling car chase taking place in Houston, Texas. But that wasn't what made me pass out. It was my recollection of an event that happened months ago. Moreover, the date and time was on the screen right above the newsfeed that ran along the bottom of the screen. It had happened almost a year ago, 7 or 8 months ago anyway. I looked out the window and didn't see the dull brown grass around the building, as it must be today, late November. Instead, I saw the smoothly trimmed zoysia grass and the budding ornamental trees of mid to late March. "Mr. Chandler, are you all right?" Marge, one of the secretaries in Mr. Thompson's company, asked. I was leaning against the wall and looked gray. At least that's how I felt. Thank goodness I was too shocked by what I saw around me to say anything. I'd probably say something stupid or out of line enough for Marge to call for the guys with the nets and straitjackets. "Yes, yes, Marge. I must have eaten something at lunch that I didn't like," I said unconvincingly. Marge smiled at me and walked back to the front desk. I turned down the hallway leading to the stairs and went up to the second floor. On the way to my old office, I met nothing but familiar faces and smiles. What I didn't meet was anyone or anything that could explain my presence here, in this place, at this time. I closed the door to my office and sat down to gather my thoughts. I looked around the surroundings of my office. Nothing had changed from a few months ago. I saw the family photos on the desk and the gloom came over me again. Francine and the girls were still smiling at me from the frames. Also in the frame was a family photo from our wedding reception 16 years ago. Well, a little over 15 if the date on the TV was correct. The whole family was there, including Alicia. Oh, Alicia. If only. Now not only was she not mine, she was no one's. Alicia passed away earlier this year from cervical cancer. The cancerous tumor was not detected early enough because no one would have believed it could occur in such a young woman. Had it been detected early enough, and had she had a complete hysterectomy, she could have lived for many more years, even decades. Now she's just gone. Alicia left behind not only her own family, but also her little 3-year-old son and her asshole husband Frank Deal, the rapist her father set her up with right after we broke up and after she graduated from college. It seems the Deal family, who lived mostly in the Savannah area, was prominent in Georgia business and politics, and Dad wanted Alicia to marry someone well-connected. Frank hadn't turned out to be as influential as expected. Even his own family had been close to disowning him, except when it came to hitting Alicia right or left. What an asshole. Yeah, Alicia had put all that behind her. Well, she left me behind too, of course. I never lost my deep emotional attachment to Alicia. Thoughts of if only often visited me when I was depressed about how my life with Francine and the girls had turned out. At that moment, my worst fears of being caught trespassing in the Thompson building were confirmed. J. Carter Thompson himself burst into my office without knocking or other common courtesies. I stood and prepared myself to have to endure another outburst of his anger, as well as contact security to have my unauthorized ass thrown out of his building. But instead, he gave me a very cheerful smile. "Congratulations, Lou," my supposedly former father-in-law said in a friendly voice that was far from the norm, even before the divorce. "You've talked the Allen brothers into going along with us. You're going to get a substantial bonus this month. I'm proud of you, boy." Mr. Thompson then, after giving me a slap on the back, turned and strode purposefully toward the exit, leaving me almost completely out of breath. The Allen brothers. I've got them to make a deal with. Hell. From downstairs, the date was showing on CNN. I looked outside to see early spring instead of late fall. It was that relatively peaceful time a few months before everything in my life went downhill. Not believing this was possible, I sat down and put my elbows on the table. I raised my hands to cover my face. And then I saw it. Around my wrist was the chain of a simple bracelet with a strange stone in a simple setting. There was nothing beautiful or outstanding about it. It was just lying where I had put it when I took the airplane from Minneapolis in a few months. I looked at the Outlook calendar on my workstation. Aha. It was indeed 8 months before I traveled to Minneapolis. And yet I had a bracelet that my mind told me I had gotten there, and then, as a gift from a guy named Mookie. I had a panicked thought. What if I didn't just mentally and emotionally go back to an earlier time? And if I went back physically, what would I do if I encountered my other self belonging to that timeline? Nope. Somehow I knew that I had just returned to my own timeline and was in my own body from a few months ago. And also, the stone bracelet of Nasib had apparently returned with me. Somehow, some force, or whatever it was. Associated with this Nasib stone brought my consciousness back in time with the Nasib stone. I could only guess that the presence of the stone was to serve as a guarantee that it had indeed worked, and to reinforce the fact that it was indeed behind the strange circumstances I had gotten myself into. But I was now aware of what might have been, and of what was likely to happen in a few months. Now, if my eyes and other senses were to be believed, I wouldn't go to Minneapolis. I wouldn't meet Mookie and get that Nasib stone in my bracelet from him. Yes, I did know its name. And I probably wouldn't be served with divorce papers and fired. Wow. If my dates are correct, I was just over 4 months away from my world falling apart. What can I start doing now to make sure that doesn't happen? I pulled out a pen and notepad. I needed to make some plans, taking into consideration what my loving wife and my father-in-law had planned for me. In the end, I decided that I couldn't count on the divorce not happening. I remembered how quickly, in another timeline, Francine had gotten Stedman Carstairs firmly established in my house and what used to be our bed. Anyway, I didn't grow the size balls I used to have. I was still afraid of confrontation, still subject to the authority of my boss and father-in-law, and still mostly subject to Francine's desires and aspirations. No. It was too late to change the course of events that would lead to my divorce and termination. But in this timeline, I had something extra that I didn't have before. I had foresight, and I had anger. In that other reality, I was divorced and left almost destitute. I was replaced by a guy who apparently drafted my favorite bride for years, and apparently continues to do so even now. My girlfriends were pitted against me. My career here came to an end, and I was forced to look for a new job. Oh yeah, and I was sent on my way with threats of possible legal action for harassment if I made things difficult. And it all started with a lie backed up by the perjury of some woman named Joan Hartman, whom I had never met as far as I can remember. I may not be able to change much about the outcome of the impending divorce. Oh yes, this time I've resigned myself to the inevitable. But at least I wasn't going to be kicked out of this company with no consequences, and a hell of a lot of compensation. And I was damn sure going to get myself a better lawyer and be better prepared. Oh, and this time I was going to set aside some funds for an emergency. I wanted to be able to do more with my finances afterward, not just stand around rubbing my last 2 nickels in my pocket like I used to. I stared for a while at the Nasib stone in the setting of the chain bracelet I wore. The thing was obviously giving me a way to prepare myself to right at least some of the injustices that awaited me along the way. But what if it still didn't work out? What if there were other emotional challenges ahead of me? Will the Nasib stone be able to help me again? Or was it just a one-time miracle? There was no point in worrying about that now. I had enough to worry about for the foreseeable future. I set the notebook aside and thought about it. I was beginning to feel less of the emotional turmoil I had experienced during and after the divorce in that other timeline. I still didn't feel brave enough to pounce on all my adversaries and start implementing a scorched earth policy. After all, I had never shown that kind of resolve in my life. But now I did feel a little master of the situation. And that suddenly made me feel a little calmer. Peace. That guy, Mookie, said that his father told him stories about how the Nasib stone transports its owner to a place of peace. It may not be a place of peace in the long run, but I felt a strange peacefulness in this place, and at this time, at least for the moment. And that feeling was a real blessing that I haven't experienced in a very long time. Next chapter. As the anxious days approached, my position for the near future became more and more stable. I had been gathering information about Old Man Thompson's dubious dealings for years, almost from the moment he had taken over the small company I worked for, and Francine had infiltrated. During that period, I already knew that he had discovered my little electronic stash of evidence on my computer and network server, and planned to deal with it accordingly. So in the first couple of days of my return, I backed up all of my materials to DVD-Rs for off-site storage, leaving the files that Thompson knew he would find on my workstation's hard drive and on a shared network drive. The DVD-R copies were placed in a safe deposit box at a local bank, completely unrelated to the bank Francine and I had used all those years together. I also set up an emergency fund account and began liquidating all possible assets to build a nest egg in case of what would happen in the next few weeks after my return. Francine even noted a few days afterward that I seemed to be withdrawing money from the ATM more often, and she hopes I haven't become a profligate spender. Francine. She was still just as I remembered her before the divorce. She still pestered me constantly and demanded it was either her or nothing in all decisions regarding our family. The only weapon in my defense, given my still somewhat meek nature, was information. I knew what and when was going to happen. But this time, I was a little better prepared. Still, being prepared was not the same as preventing. And it was too late when I found myself back at that slightly earlier point in my life. I had only been back for a week when Francine broached the dreaded subject. Lou, what's wrong with you? Naturally, she said it without any connection to what we discussed that night after we got home, or dinner, or evening classes until we sent the girls to bed. She simply said, "It's okay, honey," I said, putting all my contrived southern charm into this affectionate address. Why do you ask? It's just that you're well, moody, I guess you'd say. That's right, Moody. She nodded, finally realizing exactly what she was describing. Francine realized what was happening, and I saw a cloud descend over her face. Then she must have decided that I needed to be calmed down a bit, due to the grand scheme she and my father were about to pull on me, because she sighed and set the magazine aside. Okay, I guess we can do it tonight. Just give me at least 15 minutes to get ready to get up. With those words, she got up and headed upstairs. I noticed that on her way to the stairs, she went to her purse and pulled out her cell phone, and I was suddenly overcome with foreboding. Needless to say, Francine had barely made it up the stairs before I jumped to my feet and, taking off my shoes so as not to make any noise, rushed up the stairs and down the hallway to a spot just outside our bedroom. From there, I could hear her speak in a low voice, almost a whisper. Yes, you know I have to do this a few more times. If I don't, Loser will suspect something wrong. That means I'll still have to play the role of loving wife and give in to him from time to time. Well, that confirmed my suspicions about her infidelity. However, surprisingly, I felt absolutely no sense of outrage, just resigned to what was happening and obviously was happening. But it won't be for long, my love. Then Frankie can go back to his stallion. I shook my head in disgust. Although I wasn't 100% sure yet that she was talking to her former beau, Stedman Carstairs, the nickname she was using for whoever was on the other end of her call indicated it. Yes, that marriage was dead. And by the looks of it, it had been dead for quite some time. Prior to my comeback, I simply hadn't paid enough attention to my relationship with Francine. Either she or my own shyness kept my attention elsewhere, as emotional self-defense against her constant battering. Not now. I mean, I still wasn't ready for a confrontation. But I wasn't nearly as upset as I'd been before the comeback. Look, I've got to run. He'll be here any minute, and I'm going to have to give him another trait of mercy. No, of course I won't do anything to him except the bare necessities. You know I'm leaving myself and everything else to you, sugar. Not tonight, my dear, I thought. Next chapter. I did a little research before the expected figurative death knell sounded for my marriage. Our company's HR department had been outsourced by contract, and I made a surprise visit to the company that handled it. There I was met by my attorney, much more experienced than in my former reality. He was already on standby, preparing for what he thought was my expected demand for a divorce from my wife. I couldn't let him know that I knew she was going to sue me. "Why are we here, Lou?" my attorney John London asked. "Well, John, there seems to be a vicious rumor going around the company about alleged inappropriate actions on my part. I just want to check on something for the record, and I thought you should be with me in case I run into any obstacles in getting what I need today," I said. John just shrugged and said, "Whatever you say," looking at his chronometer. A classy lawyer wouldn't wear a simple watch. I suppose he was calculating the number of billable hours he was accruing for this profligate client. Only I knew that the payout from this visit could offset his legal fees many times over when the truth finally came out. John followed me into the office of the contract staffing firm and watched as I introduced myself and requested the work history of one Joan Hartman at Thompson Corporation, filling out the appropriate forms and presenting my company ID to confirm my access to the records. The young intern working behind the counter was full of Southern hospitality and eagerness to please. I didn't even have to introduce my attorney. 20 minutes later, I was standing outside my car in the parking lot with hard copies of the paperwork of Joan Hartman, who had actually worked at Thompson's company some time ago. It turned out that when she had left the Thompson company 50 years earlier, even before the small firm I was then working for was absorbed into Thompson, she had become Joan Burns by marrying someone not associated with the company. There was even a copy of a letter of recommendation for her, should she ever seek employment elsewhere, that had been mailed to her new address in Tacoma, Washington. "Okay," my lawyer finally asked. "Obviously, you didn't need my help getting this. So now what? What does any of this have to do with you wanting to divorce your wife?" I just smiled and said, "John, I wanted you to see me get these documents legally and firsthand." I took a deep breath of fresh air and said, "I have a feeling these documents are going to come in handy very soon, so take care to protect them at all costs. Do you understand?" "My client is definitely not right in the head," is what his facial expression silently told me. Nevertheless, he tucked the papers into his valise, shook my hand, and said goodbye. Next chapter. On the morning of the day I was to be summoned to Thompson's office for them to bring the gavel down on me, thinking I was still an ignorant loser, I had already arranged for my attorney, John London, to stop by to see me on an urgent matter. I had to crumple a bit when he asked me what exactly was so important. John arrived about 20 minutes before the time I remembered from my previous existence as Hammer Time. When he entered my office, he immediately started by saying, "Lou, what's so damn urgent and why the secrecy?" I shrugged my shoulders, smiled thinly, crossed my fingers below desk level, and replied, "John, I've been getting some strange reactions from those around me over the last day or two. Also, one of the employees who joined this company with me 16 years ago, when we were bought out and absorbed by Thompson, relayed to me over the DL that my position here may be in jeopardy. He said that, to his knowledge, it would be decided around lunchtime today. That's why I thought I might need you here. Okay, I was lying through my teeth about the hints and the so-called informant. But I really needed John to represent my interests from the moment all this shit was going to start rolling downhill. And that would be just about, and just as I remembered from that awful last time, I got the call at 11:30 a.m., right on the button. Mr. Chandler, I'm afraid Mr. Thompson has specifically stipulated that you are the only one who must be admitted, Thompson's assistant said, as if that settled the matter as John and I entered the outer rooms leading to J. Carter Thompson's office. But this time, instead of merely following her directions, I looked at my attorney, then at her again, and said quietly but firmly, "This gentleman is John London, my attorney. Regardless of what Mr. Thompson says, Mr. London is going in there with me. Is that clear?" She just sat back in her seat with her mouth open at my sudden defiance. She expected me to just do as I was ordered, as I had done many times in the past, especially since I had always been compliant, even for a low-ranking deputy sheriff. If any of the three main conspirators were surprised that I purposefully entered Mr. Thompson's office without knocking, rather than my usual meek stride, they said nothing. It was only when they noticed that a guy in a well-fitting suit and wingtips carrying a leather valise was walking with me that they spoke louder. "Chandler," J. Carter Thompson shouted, "this is a private meeting. We will be discussing important business, personal, and private matters that concern our family and this company. What do you do when you bring a stranger into my office without first saying a word of your own volition?" He was clearly annoyed, but I could also tell he was curious. Without waiting for my answer, he said, "That man will have to leave until we're done here." As before, Mr. Thompson was joined by his supposedly distraught wife Francine, the shark-toothed lawyer representing the Thompsons, and a 20-something female document processing clerk. I didn't look back when I detected movement behind me, but I knew two security guards had quietly slipped in behind me, just like last time. I just stood in the middle of the office and looked straight into Thompson's face. Unlike last time, when I bowed my head and could barely bring myself to look at him. This time, I threw the first can of gasoline into the legal bonfire they'd already lit here. I'm afraid I have to insist that my attorney John London remain by my side during anything that may happen here. The expressions of the faces in front of me were priceless as I noted their surprise and consternation when I said the word lawyer. What? What are you? Thompson didn't quite manage to regain his aplomb as he began to see this elaborate situation not just slip from his absolute control, but cascade rapidly. But J. Carter Thompson was a major player in the business world and had not achieved his position by being slow to react. Besides, he was a world-class negotiator, and now he was letting those skills go to waste. "You see, Chandler," he began, in a tone that I'm sure seemed more reasonable and conciliatory, designed to throw me off balance so he could strike. "I am sure we can resolve our little difficulties without getting out of hand. After all, I'm sure you knew that sooner or later we would discover your petty shenanigans, given the security and oversight measures in place here. Right?" I guess he figured I'd give in, as usual. In this he was mistaken. "Mr. London will stay to witness whatever you tell me," I said simply and softly, without bravado. I didn't raise my voice or even smirk. After all, I was still shaking with fear of having to get into a physical or emotional confrontation with anyone. I'm just not the confrontational type. But a tiny voice in the back of my mind assured me that I just had to stand my ground. And I did. But it wasn't easy. Thompson, his lawyer, and Francine spent about 10 seconds looking among themselves. I guess they were trying to determine from their facial expressions alone which one of them would try to save the play they were putting on here this morning. Finally, Mr. Thompson said, "All right." He then looked around and nodded to the young woman holding the ill-fated envelope I had been waiting for weeks for. She approached me and began her story. "Mr. Louis Chandler?" she asked, and the others stood silently looking at her. This time they weren't grinning as wide as before. "Yes, that's me." I said it without any bravado, but this time I wasn't so insecure. "Mr. Chandler, you've been served," she said, placing a large, sealed envelope in my hand. The faces of the big three standing in front of me must have had the same look of shock on them this time as the last time I hadn't even looked at the envelope I'd been handed. I just propped it under my chin and turned to the process server with a positive smile as she took my picture. I then handed the package to my attorney. Now he's going to start acting, I thought as I handed the packet to John. And sure enough, he started. My client has nothing to say right now, John quickly stated as he tucked the packet under his arm and opened his valise. I realized from the way he said it that John's statement was meant more for me, a reminder that I shouldn't say anything, than for the others. He pulled out a fancy stationery knife and easily cut through the packing materials. The document server, taking advantage of being distracted, slipped quietly out the office door. Pulling out the divorce papers, John went through them the way lawyers do, flipping through the pages, something only they know how to do theatrically, and, as the audience would say, with such seriousness. You can count on us to spend the requisite amount of time scrutinizing these documents before responding. So all I had to do was idiotically sign off on all the points, as I had in the previous installment of this episode. That wasn't going to happen this time. John stuffed the pages back into the original packing material and slipped the whole thing into the valise before closing it. Stopping with the valise half closed, he noticed the look on my face and the slight shake of my head. Is there anything else? My attorney asked, sensing that I could tell from the looks on the faces of my three opponents that there was more to come. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and looked at Francine. I almost laughed, and would have laughed if I hadn't been still somewhat depressed by the normal existence of conflict in my presence. But Francine evidently took the hint and followed her stage cues well. Louis, she said quietly. But this time she looked at me with an unconvincing expression of resentment and indignation. How could you? Since I knew what was coming next, I simply turned to Mr. Shark Teeth and waited for his next statement. Mr. Chandler, Thompson's attorney announced just at that moment. I have a deposition from Joan Hartman, an employee of the department you influenced in hiring, firing, and promoting, in which she alleges that you coerced her on numerous occasions. He waved a familiar piece of paper that had all the hallmarks of officialdom. Hearing the name Joan Hartman, I glanced to my left and saw John London twitch in surprise. I looked at him intently and raised my hand briefly so he wouldn't have time to jump up and say something. I could tell he remembered the name Joan Hartman, and it only took him a fraction of a second to realize what was happening. Give me a microscopic nod, and then assume a posture of stern attention to the details of what was happening. You, sir, continued Mr. Shark Teeth, are not only guilty of adultery with this innocent woman. With that, he pointed to Francine, who was now busily reaching for a napkin from her purse, as I broke the rhythm of the meeting that would have otherwise allowed her to have already put one napkin to her eye, apparently ostensibly to wipe away a tear. You are also in violation of the prenuptial agreement you signed before you entered into union with Francine Thompson. And I might add, Thompson looked at me with an expression not exactly of anger, but more of curiosity at my reaction than the satisfaction he expected from seeing me squirm. You are in violation of company policy prohibiting inappropriate personal relationships between senior and subordinate employees. Next, he leaned toward me and took off his glasses to make his next statement exactly on target. And you should just be happy that Mr. Thompson isn't going to pursue your prosecution under violations of state or federal labor laws. As I said, my client has nothing to say right now, John London said to the three men, who were now looking at me with some relief that their elaborate setup had not fallen apart from my slightly unorthodox behavior and the unexpected presence of a lawyer as my defense counsel. They expected me to find myself ignorant, unarmed, and alone in all this. But I wasn't that ignorant. I expected it. I wasn't unarmed. Information is the most valuable weapon a fighter can wield. And I had already decided that, as unaccustomed as I was to it, this was a kind of fight. After all, I wasn't alone. John London looked at me with a, "You may have set me up, but I thrive on this shit" expression as he turned toward the door, holding my elbow in his hand, trying to pull me out of there. But Mr. Thompson and Francine still had a few more lines to say. You have 30 minutes to clear your desk and office of all personal belongings. Needless to say, from that point on, you may not log onto the computer network, as your access to it has been revoked. One of these gentlemen will take your keys and your parking lot entry card from you. Thompson said it in an obviously rehearsed tone, but he still managed to portray the indignant look of a superior. And you bastard! Francine cut in. Your stuff is packed and stacked by the front door of the condo. I've changed the locks, so you should come by tonight when I'm there, but before 8 o'clock tonight. I guess I was amazed that I could still surprise Francine, because I was really taken aback by the way her jaw dropped in shock when instead of crying or begging or looking crazy, I just said, okay. I didn't even bother to ask about the girls, since I already knew they lived in the Thompson house in Stone Mountain with her mother. Then Francine, even though I didn't react as I expected, went a little overboard. I have also applied for a restraining order to keep you away from me and the girls, as I fear that your previous signs of aggressive behavior could put me and my children in danger. Mr. Shark Teeth handed me another document, which I took again without looking at it, and then handed it to John London. Instead of seeing me explode with anger or shake my head in surprise, they saw me stand expressionless as far as I could tell. I couldn't see my face, but I had practiced putting on an unaccustomed expression that I considered stone-faced, and again said softly, okay. Even J. Carter Thompson was beginning to realize that his plan was not going at all the way he had envisioned. He seemed to be contradicting himself on how he should proceed, but only for 5 seconds. Get him out of my office and out of the room as quickly as possible, Thompson ordered those behind me. In an unusual move for me, I smiled before turning to leave. As the security guys moved to put their hands on my elbows, my lawyer intervened and stood in front of me and said, if you so much as lay a finger on my client, you can be sure you will soon be standing before a DeKalb County judge on assault charges. The security guys looked over my shoulder to see what the boss was saying. Apparently, they got the right signal, because they backed off and just walked around John and me as we left Thompson's office, walked down the hallway, went into my office, and, later, through the door leading to the parking lot. Well, John said to me with a thin smile, you obviously got some good and timely information. I applaud you for making the right friends. It could have been very nasty out there. He paused and looked away for a second as we both started toward my car before he spoke again. So, are you going to tell me what this Joan Hartman nonsense is all about? Asked London. I remember you showing me her file, and since she left the area before you moved on to work for Thompson, we both know that their whole case for divorce and your dismissal is built on a solid foundation of pure nonsense and probably perjury. So what are you thinking? By this time, I had reached my car and was stowing a box of stuff from the office in the trunk. Closing the lid, I said, my marriage is a farce, John, so I'm not too worried about breaking up with Francine for good. As for the kids, I love them dearly and don't want to lose them, but I just don't know what to expect from these people under a so-called restraining order based on my alleged anger issues. Don't worry, John replied. It may take a week or two, but I'm sure I can get that restraining order lifted. Now, what about this Joan Hartman? I looked at my lawyer and smirking said, John, you're going to make me a very rich man with a wrongful termination lawsuit, and just in case you're not doing too badly yourself. After the divorce judgment is entered, and only then, based on this delusional assertion, do I want you to sue for $16 million in damages. I am basing this on a calculation of $1 million for each year that I was with Thompson and Joan Hartman was not. Then I want you to raise the amount by another $2 million and threaten them that if they try to countersue, they will go to the prosecutor's office on perjury charges. Then, I want you to raise the amount by another $500,000 every time they offer an alternative settlement amount. John's smirk began to match mine, and he told me, you know the final judgment in a lawsuit like this probably won't reach that amount. I mean, judges don't usually award the plaintiff such a high amount in cases like this. But we should get a heck of a return on the lawsuit with so much evidence in our favor and the obvious chutzpah of Thompson and his lawyer. Oh yes, we should do just fine. We both started laughing as he shook my hand and headed to his car, while I climbed into mine to drive to my new apartment, which I had already arranged for and had already had furniture delivered. My new apartment was in Sandy Springs, as it had been in the past, but this time I had time to prepare, and I had found a much nicer place to live. Also, I had set aside enough financially to handle things like the deposit and extras for now. As for my stuff in the apartment Francine was talking about, damn, I could go and get them. That way I could piss her off even more without being depressed and needy, as she no doubt expected me to be in all of this. As for my girls, I knew that Francine would try to use my love for them as a weapon against me. But I also realized that there was nothing I could do about it now. The indirect mention I had gotten in my previous existence, a few months after the divorce, that I might not be the biological father of either of my daughters, was still lingering in the back of my mind. But biology doesn't invalidate a father's love for his children. They were still my girls. I had simply loved Chelsea and Gracie for too many years to turn off my feelings for them in their innocence. And that innocence certainly didn't extend to my cheating slut ex-wife. I pulled into the street and turned on the local news radio station to listen to Rush. When his standard music came on, heralding the start of another hour of what he called excellent broadcasting, I started laughing out loud. More from relief that today's confrontation was over than from how it had ended. Next chapter. The divorce is granted, the judge announced, and banged the gavel, concluding our final hearing after months of document gathering, evidence, testimony, and waiting. We didn't actually have to be physically present, but John London had directed that he and I be here, and that Francine's attorney, who was also Mr. Thompson's attorney, be here as well. I stood next to John as he looked toward the back of the small courtroom and nodded to the DeKalb County Sheriff's deputy standing at the very door. The deputy approached Francine's attorney, who was clearly furious at being forced to be physically present for what was a simple formal announcement that would be published in the newspaper anyway. Are you, by any chance, Mr. James Cantrell, attorney for Miss Francine Chandler, N.C.E. Thompson, and Mr. J. Cade Thompson and the Thompson Corporation? The deputy asked almost nonchalantly. I guess Francine's attorney was just still annoyed that his morning had been ruined and didn't pay much attention to it. He simply replied, Yes, I'm James Cantrell. What happened next made him take notice. You, Dryad, have already been served, said the deputy. He handed the package he was carrying to Cantrell and quickly left. John London and I just stood there and watched the various expressions on Cantrell's face change to reflect the changes in his emotions as he first opened the envelope and then looked shocked at the documents he held in his hands. Finally, turning to John and me, he expressed anger and indignation. You're out of your minds. There's no way you can expect this lawsuit to gain the confidence of the court. He's never, Cantrell began. The hands in which he held my motion to file a complaint against his client and the huge sum based on wrongful termination were visibly shaking. John interrupted him by holding out a packet of certified copies of Joan Hartman's documents that he had been extracting at my request over the past few months. You might want to familiarize yourself with them before you use words like never in reference to this lawsuit, he said. As Cantrell began reviewing the documents, I realized that when he was prepared, he was good at his job of making a confident face in court on behalf of his clients. But he wasn't good enough for me not to notice the slight weakening of his confidence in his position as he familiarized himself with the truth of the situation he faced. Cantrell now knew that his clients had planted the false documents that served not only as the basis for my just completed divorce, but also for my dismissal from Thompson Corporation. The highlighted dates showed that I was not even working at Thompson at the same time as this Joan Hartman, with whom I was supposedly having an affair, and that she had left the company over 16 years ago, just as I had joined the company. Even with my lack of experience in all this, I could tell that he realized he was screwed. Well, I mean his clients. Lawyers are almost never on the losing end. Finally, he said the only thing he could say at such a moment. We'll get back to you on that. John smiled predatorily at Cantrell and said, Just don't take too long. You can call my assistant and make an appointment. I had one more thing I had to do personally this morning. I handed Mr. Cantrell a DVD-R containing copies of electronic documents that indicated years of unethical and illegal business activity by Mr. J. Carter Thompson and his CFO at the Thompson Company. I said, "Be sure to pass this on to my former father-in-law, for his eyes only, not yours. It might make him want to hurry up. Assure him that I will act discreetly if he is not slow to agree to my lawsuit." My lawyer threw up his head and grasped my arm with one hand and picked up his valise with the other. He then quickly led me out of the courtroom and into the hallway. "Would you like to tell me what that reckless stunt was? What was on that disc you gave him? If you've ruined the case in any way by your actions, you can just get yourself a new lawyer, after paying all my fees, of course." John London was furious, and I don't think I blamed him for anything. And, as befits my nature, I recoiled from his verbal attack on me. When he subsided and waited for me to respond, I finally took a breath and replied, "Thompson has been conducting shady and illegal activities for years, long before I came aboard," I said. "I'm just offering him a little incentive to settle this suit. Or I'll have to take a copy of this disc to the DA's office or even the FBI field office in Atlanta." "Look," John told me, still very angry with me, "this is the kind of thing you should leave it up to me to decide." "John," I said, "you and I both know that if you had actually read what was on the disc, or if Cantrell had read any of it rather than giving it to Thompson, either of you would just have to go to the DA's office. After all, even as my attorney, you're still an officer of the court, right?" John made it clear that he disapproved of my actions, and he had to admit that he would have to take any evidence of Thompson's criminal actions to the DA. After yelling at me for another minute or two just to vent, he pulled himself together and said, "It's lunchtime and we're going to Sonny's. Your treat." I smiled, and together we walked to my car, my mouth already wanting Sonny's BBQ and sweet iced tea. And with that, we entered the next exciting phase of my return to this particular timeline. End of part 1. Part the second of may be coming out in 10 hours. Write in the comments if you're waiting for it. Also, give a like under this video and subscribe to my channel. I hope you enjoyed this video.